welcome to Gerg and Muxl, a podcast that seeks to explore the unexplored topics in games, how they work, why they work, and why we love them. I am Muxl.
Gerg here.
And we are here to talk about user interfaces and user experiences in games today. That's like a super big topic, so we're definitely not going to hit all of that. We're going to be talking a lot about like gauges and ways to measure things, but probably some other things too.
I think we're actually going to stay pretty much, even though some of our past episodes have been pretty action game focused.
Yeah.
Kind of in that realm.
That's true.
Action platformer kind of third person games as opposed to other specific genres. So obviously we could do different ones. And I think the genre is this huge level of it has a big difference on the way your UI is going to work. I think we'll be able to pull out some general stuff about UI in general in games, partially because this episode was inspired in large part actually by some of my experiences DMing for the first time, or a game that actually one of my friends is building.
A board game.
Yeah, a board game. Yep. That I have been helping play test, and one of my major concerns of feedback was the UI. So that's kind of what got us thinking. So there's more to it than just the genre, but I do think genre. Like as we were talking, RTSs came up, and I was like, oh my god, that's an entire episode in terms of the way that RTSs have to communicate so much information in real time, no less. In a turn-based strategy, at least, you have the ability to go between menus and think about just kind of the overall bloat of JRPG, UIs, where it's just menu after menu after menu. You can do that. RTSs don't get that luxury, and they have to have an immense amount of information conveyed, and we're not going to be able to cover all of that.
No.
But to begin, I mean, obviously the first piece of UI, user interface, is to be conveying information about your game in a intuitive, and I think it's pretty easy to agree across the board that the more intuitive and less kind of up in your face obstructionist, I don't know.
Yeah.
What's the word? The better in general. You see, it usually the more streamlined the UI can be particularly for video games, but also in other things, the better it is. That seems to be just kind of baseline. You want to be non-intrusive.
Right. And that means that you want to use things like colors, sizes, patterns, shapes, like pretty much anything other than text. If you can do without text, that is better. Yeah. And if you can consolidate all of your text to sort of like one area where because eventually, yes, somebody might want to read like this does plus, 1% damage to fire types or something like that. You know, at some point, that's going to be hard to say with just symbols. I've seen some games where it just gets a little symbol crazy, and you're just
you're like, okay, come on.
Just
give me words. I need.
We have symbols; they're called words.
Yeah.
Anyway, at some point,
ooh, that's deep.
At some point, you do need words, but I would say, especially in games, there's a high focus on real-time interactions with UIs. It's not like going to a website, right? You have to be able to get the information you need without hardly even paying attention to the UI that's supposed to give it to you. And so the UI needs to be very intuitive and not a lot of reading, right? Because when you're reading, that takes both of your eyes, right? You can't just read out of the corner of your eye. Most people can. I don't know. There's probably some people who can somehow read out of the corner of their eye. But most people need to look at the text. And if you're looking at the text, then you're not looking at what's happening in the game.
And that speaks well to like what reading is good for, to just take a step back, I guess. Like we said, in terms of games are real time, it's interactive, right? And it matters being able to convey information. Like books don't suffer. What is text good for? It is conveying as much information as possible, right? It is we've agreed, books, we found the best way to communicate stories was via just pretty much text in large part for a long time. Or the most detail, that's why books are always better than movies, right? Or rather they said you can get so much more depth out of words because they say exactly what you need. The ideal book wasn't some combination of pictures and symbols and words that we have, right? That's not what happened. It's just straight pages and pages of text because that's the densest way that we figured out to communicate information. And for what you're doing with a book, that's exactly what you need. Games are not that way at all, actually.
Right.
And so that's a great point. And to think about, the example specifically, my friend Shepard is building a game. He's a very creative person, and he just always needs to be doing something. So he's like, oh, I'll build a board game. That sounds fun. But he's also an engineer by trade, which is interesting. So he loves board games too, and he built a game that is. It was interesting as we were playing it. So it felt really complex. And this is kind of what sparked this whole discussion, was that the game itself when I took a second and reflected on particularly other board games or just like a game you'd get at like a game shop that are kind of like you'd have to sit down and like learn it, right? Not kind of like Monopoly or something like that, but like kind of like, you know, the artisan like indie games that come out, board games. You do have to like sit down and learn them. And I was reflecting on that, or even just any other kind of basic video game. And the game that Shepard built was not anywhere close to more complex than these other games at all.
Right.
It was the fact that the information and the complexity wasn't communicated well enough for me to be able to wrap my mind around it. Every single time I had to do something, or every single time everyone had to do something, you had to go back and read something, or you had to go back and relearn something that you shouldn't have to relearn. Hopefully it would be more intuitive and you'd be able to just glance at something and get the information.
Right.
That wasn't the case for Shepard's game, partially because it's like on its 0.2 iteration, you know, it's super early. But at the same time, that was a big, huge wake-up to me in terms of the level of importance that communicating information is. No matter, like, that was separate from the complexity of a game. You could actually have a not that complex game that communicates poorly, and it would feel really hard to play. And you could have incredibly complex games that have really brilliant, intuitive UIs that give you tons of information, and you're able to somehow manipulate way more than you would be able to otherwise, or comprehend, and your brain can utilize so many more types of information.
Right, because when your brain isn't busy recalling information, it's busy making connections between the information in front of you.
Yeah.
Which is what UIs should help you do.
Right.
Is like understand the information, but like you shouldn't have to remember the information.
Yeah, no, that's a great summary of that, I think, and I think that was just so stark to me for the first time, where I experienced a game I think was really good mechanically that had a horrible UI, and I was like, dude, this is, until then the game can't work, like it's not going to be fun to play.
Right.
But it had so much potential, right? I'm trying to think of like the JRPG, you know, example. I was thinking of games that have super obtuse UIs, or ones that get in the way, or that the UI really takes away from your ability to enjoy the game. We've been talking a little bit about kind of like modular interactivity, like where a single button does all kinds of different things depending on the context, right? That's easy enough to do where like you just, there's a lot of games nowadays, like the modern kind of 3D action games, where it'll just have the button on screen and then like a tiny little to what it's going to do.
Right,
like
exactly.
At this point, like triangle for this.
Which does typically require that you read.
Yeah.
And I'd say that's actually one of the trade-offs of having one button do a lot of different things, is like in order to make that intuitive, you kind of can't. Like you kind of have to just tell them this is what the button's going to do.
Yeah.
But that is more of a burden on players because now they have to read what the button's going to do. They can't just hit in like a a platformer from the early 2000s. The button always did that. Right. Like whatever the button did, it probably always did that. No matter where you were. Nobody had to. There wasn't like a little tooltip that said A is jump.
In this case.
At this case, it was no, Mario always jumps when you hit A.
Exactly, yeah. Sonic, you're always jumping. Jumping is going to be a homing attack. That's like the whole thing. And then like movement.
Yeah,
that's it.
And so I think that is one of the trade-offs. I don't see how you could get around that. Like I get why they do that, but it is one of the trade-offs.
And let's just think about even like the again kind of over time things tend to get optimized to what works best in general. Sometimes that can lead to kind of stagnation. I think in terms of development, you need something big to kind of think outside the box. Nintendo's good at this, particularly in terms of they're good at thinking outside the box. Sometimes we've talked about controls particularly, and they've tried to iterate their controls and try new things, and it is fascinating in terms of just a case study, but in large part, if you look at the DualShocks, those have not changed for a long time, and no one has. I mean, the idea of 2 joysticks, D-pad, 4 buttons, and shoulders, that is like
people are very comfortable with that.
So in any case, even just think about that, right? Like when you see, I was thinking on screen, right? You see, just like with your buttons, you have a symbol. They have a location on the controller. So a kind of a top, left, right, or bottom. That's one piece of information. They have a symbol on them. In the case of, for PlayStation, those are literal symbols. For Xbox, it's letters. Right. And you have a color associated with them. And those 4 things, or 3 things, just 3 identifiers, are enough in most games to be able to communicate really, really strongly and make it really, really quick and intuitive on how to deal with that. One thing that's interesting, here's an interesting thing. I actually remember from God of War. So God of War used a lot of QTE context. Wait, QTE, is that right?
Yeah, QuickTime events.
Yeah, QuickTime events. Yep. Context starts with a C, it turns out. Context with a Q. No, QuickTime events where it was this is kind of the classic something super complex happening and you want to have some level of being able to do something with it. You hit a button and then the scene continues basically if you hit it in the right timing. God of War had tons of these, particularly for its really, really cool boss kills. And one thing they changed, they tried out in 3, and I don't know, I haven't played the new one yet, and I think they had switched it back in Ascension, which was basically 4. But before when you had to hit a button, it would appear in huge font or whatever in the middle of the screen. Mm-hmm. So every single time that you were doing something, you could just focus on the center of the screen, you'd see the button coming up, you'd hit it.
Right.
What they changed in 3 was they tried, in an attempt to try to keep the screen less cluttered, basically, mm-hmm. to be able to be on the action as well as make it more intuitive, the button that you had to press would appear on the side of the screen that it was on the controller. So square would appear on the left side of the left border of the screen, circle on the right, triangle on the top, X on the bottom, and so on and so forth. So it was, but you had to look, so you'd see it flash, and like the border would flash too. The whole border would flash gold, and then the button would appear in the middle of the border. Of the button you were supposed to press. I remember hating that, actually, when it first started. Because in those times, you're so focused on... The QTEs they get pretty darn precise.
Right.
And I remember, and maybe there's no way about this, maybe it's just a flaw of the system itself, but like, I didn't focus more on the combat because of that. It made it harder, it just made it strictly harder to complete the QTE.
Yeah. Because you had to look in 4 different places at the same time.
Basically, instead of just focusing on one area and then knee-jerking whatever the symbol was. Like, the symbol was enough information, actually, to complete those tasks.
Yeah.
We didn't need the directional aspect of it. In fact, that took away from it. So, all that is to say, that was just a thought I had. Like, yeah, there's no easy answers, as ever, with game design, it seems. Where just throwing more pieces of information at a player doesn't actually necessarily make it easier.
No, yeah, if UIs can start feeling cluttered and like, you only need a couple of things maybe.
Right. Yeah. And that was sufficient in that case, and adding a new dimension, which was the direction, was actually not necessary for the game. As well as I don't think it quite succeeded at what it was trying to do, which was making me focus more on the action. Mm-hmm.
Why do you think that it wasn't just enough for you to like know the 4 directions? Because was it always one of those 4 buttons?
Yeah.
You never needed to hit like a shoulder or anything?
No, that's not true entirely either, actually.
Okay.
There'd be shoulder buttons as well as directional, like half turns or full turns or rotate on the D-stick or on the joystick.
Yeah, that seems like a real downfall.
So the buttons would only ever be the ones that would go, and the other ones would appear in the center.
Okay.
So yeah, that was just a failure. I think like focusing even in terms of like where your eyes are. Like when I knew a button was going to be coming up, I'd have to like unfocus my eyes a bit to like keep the whole screen in context and then be able to knee jerk to the button, as opposed to if I know it's appearing in the center, I can just be watching the action in the center actually until the button appears and I can hit it and it goes away real quick.
Right.
So like the goal of being able to be less cluttered actually kind of failed a little bit because I focused less on what was happening, like the animations and the action, and more on where the button was going to show up, which meant I had to be looking at the entirety of it instead of focusing in one area.
Was it not enough to just know, like, oh, it's the top is blinking, so I hit triangle?
It was just a lot less intuitive. It might be because they primed me to be learning that whole system.
Sure.
With just the buttons and not thinking in those terms. But no, I would never. That wasn't the way I was thinking.
Right.
At all. So maybe it was just me. Maybe that worked great for other people.
Yeah, well, that's the thing that I was thinking is like it's hard because different players have different expectations of like what is intuitive and like what is helpful for a UI. Yeah. And I think that one of the things that is really helpful when game designers do it well is actually the symbiosis between level design and UI.
Sure.
Right? Like you can use it as part of your UI that like when enemies flash red, then they're vulnerable or something like that. But you can't just like expect the player to know that, and you certainly don't want to hit them over the head with some audio clip or some paragraph explaining that when enemies are flashing, then they're vulnerable to attack.
Yep.
Like you want to onboard them to that mechanic in a sort of gentle way and sort of show them, don't tell them, right?
Yeah.
And so like eventually they'll figure out when they hit an enemy flashing red that it's like weak in that state, and that's great. And so you should convey that other ways once they hit it. You know, maybe there's some special animation. Right. And so you can build up a more complicated UI almost in the level itself, but you have to give it to them slowly. Yeah. Like you can have certain platforms that when you stand on them for too long, they crumble underneath you.
Right. And you can recognize what those look like eventually.
Right. And that you could consider that like part of the UI, I guess. Like the fact that the platform looks a little cracked or something like that.
The classic.
And so but again, you don't want to just hand the player a bunch of text in the beginning explaining all that stuff.
Totally, and that's I mean, back again to the Arkham examples, just because again that's so salient. But that's one huge thing with the combat system that I think it actually does really well, which is depending on, in large part, certain enemies will be. You can't just attack normally based on a weapon or something they're holding. So like there's enemies with riot shields, you have to attack them from above. There's enemies with like electric like stun batons, you have to like dodge over them and attack them from behind. And there's nothing inherently about a shield or stun baton that says like, hey, you should attack you should be able to attack the shield wielder from behind too, right? Or the stun baton from above. But that's not the way the game works. And so when they slowly introduce new types of enemies, and when they do that, they do have to say like sent into a PR screen that says like to bypass this defense, do this. Not very elegant, but it works. And then when you do that 3 or 4 times, it actually gets really complex really, really fast. And when you have all of those different enemy types on screen and it's all in real time, suddenly you have to be making, even though you only have 3 or 4 ways to attack, you have to be deciding which one to do at which times and what you can get away with and when to be doing that. And it actually becomes very deep and very involved. But like I said, that's kind of not a great. So that's an interesting one in terms of once you teach it, once it's learned, then it becomes entirely intuitive, right? You see stun baton, you know I have to jump over and then attack from behind, as opposed to stun and then air attack to take out a riot shield. So there's no text or anything floating other than just the character model. So all the information is conveyed in the character models really well. But to teach it the first time, they needed to use text. There's no way to do that intuitively in another way. So that's like a weird in-between, right? I think the perfect design would be you see an enemy and you immediately know how to attack it because that's the way it's designed, and you don't have to tell anything. And then obviously when there's a lot of them, you can tell it because each one's individual.
Right. Like I would say an ideal level design for that would be you face off against one guy with a stun baton. Doesn't do a lot of damage. You have to figure out how to kill him. Eventually you figure out, to kill him I have to attack him from behind. From then on, right? And that's I would like that better than like some guy just handing it to me.
Yeah. And that's kind of what they do. They'll only introduce a couple of them, like an enemy type, but they also give you they don't let you figure it out. They just have the instructions.
They just tell you. Yeah.
And here's we don't have to linger on this one too long, but there's one instance where this didn't happen. My girlfriend can attest to this, where there was an enemy that I must have either missed the tutorial or it bugged and tell me how to do it. But it was basically, so they've established like the shields have to be like air attacks. There's an enemy type that has like a modular weapon system on him, so it can actually switch between them. So you can like shields will come out of his arms, or you can like electrify his gauntlets, or he can like have blades come out of his like suit.
Right.
And each one of those does different enemy types. They have to do different things too.
Interesting.
And so he was a shield dude, and for whatever reason, they had, I played Arkham games for so long, and I didn't recognize that his shield, he was a bigger like enemy type. He was like a brute with like I said, the shields like the Captain America in Infinity War, which you haven't seen. So
yeah, it's true.
Shields coming out of his arms, right?
Okay.
As opposed to just like a riot shield, which is what the normal enemies use.
Right.
And I could not figure out nothing worked on him. I tried everything, and I had to restart the mission because I couldn't figure out how to take him out. Because I never tried, for whatever reason, it didn't occur to me to do an aerial attack.
Oh.
I never tried that. It didn't like the fact that he had shields didn't equate to riot shields in my mind.
Right.
And for whatever reason, I guess I tried everything but an aerial attack. I just didn't think of it.
Yeah.
And so he was invincible. There's nothing I could do to him.
Right. Interesting.
And I couldn't figure it out. And so like I said, eventually I figured it glitched or something, so I restarted the encounter. I forget how I ended up eventually figuring it out. Anyway, point is, I would agree, but apparently in this case, either I'm just a bad game player, or there's something that wasn't. If he had a riot shield, if he'd been a big dude with a big riot shield, 100%. Right. Easiest thing in the world. But because just the shields were different by themselves, I could not figure out what in the world to do.
That speaks to what you were saying, though, about the character model, right? The character model becomes like an indicator, and this is a different character model.
Yeah.
So it's not as intuitive. Like, you probably could have figured it out. Like, it makes sense to you now.
Yeah, exactly. In retrospect, like, of course.
I'm curious were the shields different colors or were they the same color?
Oh, totally. Oh, were the shields different colors than the riot shield?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, so, like, the enemy, like, so there's normal enemies that they'll just have a big old riot shield like you see in, like gray with all of the models are exactly the same. And, like, the characters look exactly the same using them. Right. There's another enemy type that's like a brute, which is like this, like, 8-foot tall dude. Like I said, he had this, like Crisis suit on, like from the game Crisis. Like, he had this super, like, high-tech, like, cybernetic thing that could, like, generate weapons. And so yeah, he had like red lights on them. It was entirely different texture. They were circular as opposed to the riot shield that's square. He used them on both arms, so it wasn't like a same kind of like hunched over position. He was a lot more fluid and like his attack, like also there's one riot shield attack. It's just they like lunge forward. It's the same exact formation. He had this like spinning kind of like multi-attack with the riot shield.
Interesting.
That was super different than, or with his arm shields, that was super different. So there are a lot of differences in terms of, and in terms of a game that, you know, maybe this is a problem with it, that broadcast, in large part, all of its enemies act almost identically in terms of their type. It doesn't matter if they're a thug, or if they're a military dude, or if they're a boss.
What matters what the weapon is.
Yeah, exactly. And so in this case, it was, they switched it up a little bit, and my Arkham brain could not figure the damn thing out. And eventually I figured it out. I forget how. I think it was by accident, maybe.
Well, I do think there's a number of things that could have been done in that case to make it easier, and I think color coding is one of them.
Sure.
Right? Like if all the shields like had a faint blue glow, all those knives and swords were red, and all the spark things were yellow.
Yeah, exactly. Sure.
That would be like really straightforward. Like, oh, this enemy is in like red mode, so I got to treat it like somebody with a sword or a knife.
It's precisely what God of War did, actually. Like literally, the Ascension mechanic had elements that you can fuse your weapon with. You can switch between them, and so fire, ice, electricity. We were three main ones. There was like a soul one, which was purple. But literally, enemies that had like a yellow glow, you can only attack with electricity.
Right.
Ones with a blue one, you had to attack until you like took off the ice part, and then they could be attacked by anything, and so on and so forth. It's literally the exact same thing. And it was actually fun. That was a good system.
Right. Yeah, and you don't have to like you can be subtle about it, right? Like as long as the player knows to look for it, it doesn't have to be like their whole character glows blue.
Right.
Right. As long as they know what to look for when they think to themselves, how do I attack this guy?
Right. Yeah.
Where in your case, you didn't know what to look for because you're like everything about this character breaks my existing like
there's nothing
intuition.
I can quite as well as the fact that I was used to when there's a new enemy to fight, it'll give me exactly how to fight it in words on the screen.
So you were used to do that,
and that didn't happen. So I was so that's an interesting. That's I don't know. I always want to make sure I'm not just circle jerking Arkham games all the time.
Yeah, that sounds like.
And I feel like we've pointed out some problems in the potential, but I mean that was I think that's one example.
Well, speaking of games that I like, that
I was gonna say,
there's kind of some UI problems here. I think I want to talk a little bit about Final Fantasy VII, actually.
Sure. Yeah.
So
that was what I was thinking of when I was thinking of menus through menus and menus.
Yeah. So one of the main things, and the menuing, yes, I actually want to talk more about the status effects at first.
Sure.
Because there's lots of people who have played all the way through Final Fantasy VII that don't know what the status effects do.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Right. Like, what does it mean that your character is sad?
Wait, that's a status.
That's a thing.
Really?
Yeah.
There's a text.
You can be sad.
Never heard that one.
Yeah. It means that your limit bar does not fill as quickly.
That's not intuitive.
No,
I would not have guessed that.
Yeah, you can be.
I don't know what I would have guessed actually.
You can be enraged. You can be cursed, and there's all these different status effects. Like it's not ever clear exactly what they do. Like you might, if you're paying attention, have some idea of what they do, but you're not. It's not like precise.
It's all trial and error at best, right?
Yeah, and like what exactly haste is doing, things like that.
Yeah,
and so. And even like if different enemies are weak to different types of damage, it's not really communicated very clearly in Final Fantasy VII. And so I even remember you watching me and Eric play, and we were both fans of the game, but like you had questions and we were just like, we don't actually.
I do remember that.
know.
I was trying to. I mean, I do that with games. I try to get the totality of all the mechanics.
Right.
And you guys didn't necessarily have answers.
Yeah, you were like, so how much more damage does a crit do? And we're like, we don't know. It's probably like 2x, something like that. But like they never spell it out. They don't say like a crit does this much more damage. And so, or like if you're what are the mechanics are not very like how exactly armor works is like unclear. Like obviously more armor means you take less damage.
Sure.
But like what's the relationship there?
Yeah.
Again, not very clear. And so
I remember I had a few questions about the what's the powers, the Materia system?
Oh yeah.
Which is very often lauded as one of the best parts of it.
I love the Materia system.
I think it was great. I think it was really clever. But there were a lot of pieces to it that I remember. I can't remember a specific one. But there were Materia that had similar wordings, and I was asking about the difference between them, and it was like unclear. I just know this one's better. Yeah. Because like that's like the general consensus in the community.
And I would say that's a place where text is very helpful
Yeah.
because it's an extremely complex system, and you're looking to do very specific little tweaks to your character, right? You're not talking about like equipping a sword versus equipping a spear.
And you can afford it again because of the nature of the turn-based.
Because you're already in,
game.
and presumably you're already in a menu. Like you don't want to be reading that in the middle of combat, even if it's a turn-based game.
Right.
It just feels kind of clunky to pull up like a menu and read about the item that you're going to use.
Right.
Which is one of the problems I have with JRPGs. Right.
Yeah.
You have really obtusely named items like a Phoenix Down.
Yeah.
Right. Like everyone knows what a Phoenix Down does now.
Right.
But like
Right.
if it wasn't just convention, like how in the world would that's not intuitive? It's not called a like revive item.
Right.
It's called a Phoenix Down.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I guess that could be anything. It could be fire resistant. That could be It could be a bird based item.
Or like a potion.
Yeah.
A potion for what?
Yeah.
Potion could do anything.
Yeah, that's funny, isn't it? The idea that potion by itself has become like small amount of heal.
Item. Yeah, exactly.
But I wonder, was Pokemon responsible for that?
No, I'm sure it was.
No? Was that before that?
D&D.
No, I mean you have a potion of healing though in D&D. You don't just have potions.
That's a good
healing
point.
thing.
It's not abbreviated. Yeah, that's fair.
I guess that's true. Yeah, that's true.
I'm not sure where the abbreviation came in, but
Anyway, point is, no, I know what you mean, and that's interesting. Again, that's like a limit to it too, because in terms of like you don't want to. I mean, like the Materia system, for example, is so good because it is. It does have levels of abstraction to it that is easy to understand in terms of like slots. You have like the globes, the colors, the pictures along with them, and obviously the details have to have some pretty precise language along with them. But that idea of like slotting and movement and colors, that all goes into it and makes it a lot easier to the point where even seasoned players, much less probably average players, would have been able to kind of navigate it intuitively, probably not optimally, but still have beaten the game and figured stuff out and gotten the stuff that they kind of wanted to do. And maybe that's another thing that maybe people don't play games. Like game designers have to have a level of having some semblance of like catering to the people that aren't going to take that huge deep dive into the game because now they don't really want to actually like optimize. Like we're talking about being able to like understand stuff to point of optimization. Game designers might not be designing for this level of perfection or figuring out exactly optimization.
Right, kind of a good enough system. What you're suggesting.
Yeah.
And I will say that RPGs and JRPGs, turn-based combat relaxes the requirements for UI considerably.
Yep.
You can afford to have menus on menus. It's not like the most fun thing to do,
right.
But you can at least do it and not feel like it's hindering your ability to do well at the game.
And think about Pokemon, right? Like turn-based combat, I had zero understanding of the system other than like doing usually the one that sounded the coolest or like had the lowest PP I got was like gonna probably be a more powerful attack. And did those.
Right.
And like that actually got me through most of the game.
Yeah.
And I'm sure tons of kids did.
And think about like even just the simple UI of seeing it's not very effective or it's
Sure,
super effective.
sure.
Right? Like there they had to use text, I imagine, just because it would have been hard to communicate that some other way. Game Boy was very primitive and it was good at displaying text. So I think that's probably the best way they could have communicated that.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm wrong. Somebody can take me to task on that. But
I think with the amount of graphical fidelity, I think that's fair. Honestly, they didn't have too much they could do. And I'm sure future Pokemon games did that far, far better in terms of like DS level stuff.
What they could have done is like show this is an idea for like a UI from a Pokemon game. Show the amount of damage it would have done normally, and then have it do like an extra hit afterward that would do like the extra damage from it being super effective, and then you would get the sense of like, oh, cool, so it did extra damage because it's a specific type.
Sure.
And so like that might be a less intrusive way to communicate that same idea. Or like you could do the same thing if it was not very effective, right? Show the damage you would have done normally, and then they healed back some because it didn't do the full amount.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about? You want to keep talking about Final Fantasy because that seems like a good. I can only think Subway or Conway.
Context?
Nope. What's a way to get into something?
Segue.
Smooth. Oh my god. Alright, great segue, obviously, into health bar discussion. We were talking about with health bars.
Yes.
Want to just do that?
Sure.
I mean, we can talk about it in terms of Final Fantasy as well, but I mean, so think about like the most basic of video game UIs, in large part, outside of like the original text. The original like text-based, like adventure games, I guess, would be the most basic.
Yeah.
But health bars are like pretty darn basic, and everyone can understand them pretty darn quick.
Yeah. And the original health bar was like number of lives, right? It's weird to equate those, but it pretty much told you
Yeah, that's a good point, actually.
how much like you could had left to play the game, right? If you had 3 lives left, then you knew that you could play the game for a little while, and if you had 0 lives left, then you were almost done. And so like that was a simple gauge. Now it was like discrete because there were individual lives, but health bars came about when you needed to represent health more continuously, right? When you're talking about larger numbers, you don't want to have 1,000 lives, right?
Yeah, I mean, that was a classic, right?
So you have a bar, and then you care more about how full that bar is than about the exact number of hit points.
That's a great point. That is also the kind of most basic. We've talked about like progress bars before and how kind of stupid those are. I don't know if we've talked about that on air before.
I don't think so.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, in any case, a progress bar seems very often entirely arbitrary.
Yeah.
But they are. I think the reason those get used is because they are just so intuitive in terms of completion mechanic.
Right.
And health bars are no different. So the thing that was interesting to think about was how the sheer amount of information you can convey with a single health bar, and then the interaction of an attack on a health bar for like a boss, say.
Mm-hmm.
You were talking about even Mighty 9.
Oh yeah, Mighty Number 9.
Yeah.
So
talk about that a little bit.
Sure.
And the health bars and how they got used.
So I want to give credit to whoever did this. It may have been Game Soup that talked about Mighty Number 9 and the health bars. I don't know. I watched a good number of reviews of this game, but one of the things they were talking about was how the boss health bars were massive, and they were just a continuous health bar like you might expect from a game. One of the problems with that was it wasn't segmented in the way that Mega Man boss health bars classically are. Right. Normally, Mega Man health bars are each segment is it's understood to be a certain amount of health, but it's really clear when you remove a segment because they're not that big, and there are only maybe like 20 or 25 of them in the whole bar.
Right.
So like if you remove 3 segments, you know, or you remove 1 segment, you know about it.
Yeah.
And so in that way, you can gauge pretty well how much damage an attack is doing. Like that attack did 1 segment.
Right.
This attack does 2 segments. So I want to be using this attack as much as possible. Helps you to strategize. When you have a continuous bar of health, it's actually, especially in the middle of fighting a boss, and like in the middle of trying to do real-time responses to like, most people have seen what a Mega Man boss fight looks like. These are pretty similar. You're dodging a lot of attacks, there's a lot going on the screen. It's hard to tell like which attack did more, even if it's twice as much, because even twice as much is like, it's not that much, right? It's a boss. Like you're not doing half of its health.
Right, exactly.
In one attack. You're doing like 1 unit or 2 units. But when it's a continuous bar, you basically can't read that.
Right.
And so you end up just sort of doing whatever is comfortable. Like, we'll use your default attack most of the time for bosses because it's always on hand and it just is what you're used to. And it's not worth trying to figure out what's like better because you'd have to like sit there with a ruler and measure the screen.
Yeah.
And so that's a case where having segmented health bars, it wasn't. It actually, you could argue that it was an artifact of having like lower quality screens.
Fidelity.
And you couldn't have done a continuous health bar, but it actually works better.
Yeah.
And this comes into play with like car odometers too. There was a serious debacle, I guess, in like, or not odometers, sorry, speedometers.
Yeah.
Where the needle would, they used to be analog, right? We had like a needle that moved. And then people started putting in digital readouts of the number of miles per hour. And it was less helpful. Because actually it turns out the more primitive way to do it gave you better information and was better thought out than just a number.
Yeah.
And so they started putting speedometers with a needle back into a car.
Yeah.
And so it's like a similar thing where like a segmented health bar actually gives you a lot more information than one that is just a continuous number of pixels.
Yes, and that's interesting. I remember actually I remember the original minivan my family had just a digital readout, and I was a kid and I was really sad when we got a brand new 2001 Honda Odyssey. And it had a speedometer, or it had a needle. Yeah. Because from the back I couldn't read the like speed.
Right.
Because it was this big, just huge number in the middle of the dashboard on the other one, and I could know how fast we were going. And that was exciting because I was like 6. But anyway, I actually remember that, how there was a time where we just had a numerical readout. Right. And I think too, like you ended up talking about this a little bit before the cast, and we'll get to it in a second. But like rate of change is super important too, and it's so much easier to get a better sense of how fast you're accelerating via a needle moving in space, than a number going up.
Yes.
Right? It's so much harder to tell if you're going up faster. I mean, obviously, to some level, you can see when the numbers are changing.
Right.
But it's way more intuitive and way easier to tell the relative. You just get more information, more bang for your buck.
Oh yeah.
It's just more efficient, and I think that can be true. So I was thinking in both ways with the health bar thing. Like I was thinking Dark Souls, which uses health bars in its bosses, and those ones are closer. They're not segmented. Those are kind of closer to a percentage, basically, of the health that you're doing. Or rather, they're continuous at least.
Yeah.
And that was an interesting one in terms of, right, like you run up to a boss and you hit it, you unleash, the entirety, all of your stamina into an attack, or your series of attacks, and you see how much damage it does.
Right.
And that gives you so much information just by itself. It'll give you... So say you go up and you, like we were talking about this with the moth battle in
You're talking about just the presence of a health bar.
Yeah,
basically.
just the presence of a health bar at all, actually. That you run up to it, you do this much damage, you see how much that is, and then you check against, okay, how much can I see myself doing this many times, avoiding the amount of damage that I need to be able to take to be able to kill this boss? Like, is this reasonable or not? Or is it game signaling to me that, hey, you're not supposed to be doing this boss this way? Dark Souls is kind of a rough example because it is just so brutal. You might run up to a boss and attack it fully, and it does like a sliver of health, but that's actually the way the game is, and you just have to do that for like 20 minutes. Most games would be like, hey, you run up to something, you do like 1 or 2 damage to it. You're supposed to use
something else,
a different weapon, a different magic source, a different, it's a puzzle boss, X, Y, or Z. And all of that information we were just talking about, as well as like even the rate at which you should be using resources, we talked about that, right? In terms of the amount of damage, you can put in perspective the entire fight immediately, actually, in terms of what it could look like. You can get a guesstimate how long it'll take, you can get a guesstimate of how many resources it'll take, and get a guesstimate of how careful you have to be with your resources, or how careful you have to be with certain weapons or certain...
how close you are to the end.
Yep, exactly. And that all comes from a single colored bar moving up and down.
Right.
Or just down.
Convey
one direction.
Hopefully just one direction. Some bosses...
Right, exactly. Yeah.
But, yeah.
But that's insane. That single UI, the most basic of UI elements, gives so much information.
Yeah, just a gauge.
Exactly. It's hard to figure out exactly why. I guess this is more just about having a health bar versus not having a health bar. And also just depends on the type of game you're going for. Dark Souls without health bars, I think, would just be too... I think that's just too cruel.
Because you just don't give them any hope. They don't know how close they got that time.
Would anyone actually finish... I mean, I'm sure they would.
Too discouraging.
It'd be even more discouraging to see. Well, and as well as you get a sense... the other thing the health bar does, it gives you a sense of how close you got. Or if you're making progress at all. Or, hey, you took... like we were talking, like you took a third of this boss's damage off on your first try without knowing any of the context of the attacks. Hey, I could probably do this. I can probably sit here and learn this and continually doing the same thing and be able to figure out how to kill it.
And I would argue that, like, when we're talking about the segmented health bars, the reason why that doesn't work for Mighty Number 9, to not have segmented health bars, and it works fine for Dark Souls, is because switching weapons in Dark Souls is not like not a main mechanic.
Yeah, that's
right.
The point.
You aren't usually faced with a boss where you're like, nope, you needed to use this specific two-handed sword to fight this one, otherwise you can't beat it.
It's just a skill check.
Right, exactly. It's just sort of like, whereas with Mighty Number 9, you're encouraged to use these special weapons, and every boss has a weakness. Right. So you're supposed to be testing out weapons to figure out, okay, which one is the weakness.
Yeah.
In Dark Souls, it's just like, well, faster weapons do less damage, slower weapons do more damage, do whatever feels good to you.
Right.
And like,
how are you going to be able to do it?
Exactly. And so, like, it's not as important to know, like, this weapon versus that weapon, which one did more damage.
Right.
It's more important to just know, like, how far am I through this fight and how conservative do I need to be.
Yeah.
You want to talk about toughness in Diablo?
Yeah, Diablo.
I appreciate what they were trying to do. In Diablo 3, you have a stat called toughness.
Hey, we're back. This feels good.
To talk about Diablo 3?
Yeah, it's been a while. Have we ever mentioned Diablo Immortal? I don't think anyone has.
No, I don't think anyone has ever mentioned
it. No. Anyway.
So there was a stat called toughness in Diablo 3. And it was meant to capture in one number how well your character survived encounters. Right. But so it was a mixture of things, right? Because if you think about how well you can survive encounters, it's going to be a mixture of how much armor you have, your defense, how fast you regen health, and then what your total HP pool is.
That was actually different. So there was damage, recovery, and toughness.
Yes.
So recovery was your regen.
Okay.
Was your total...
Toughness didn't take into account recovery.
Correct. Toughness was how much damage you could take before you died.
Okay.
Regen was how much health you could regen.
Right. Okay.
Or recovery, rather.
Okay.
Recovery wasn't just regen, it was like health steal, It was the amount of health you could get back. It was like your passive health regen. It was like your health steal. It was like the skills and specs that you had and items that would allow you to recover health.
So they were trying to cram a lot into that one number.
Right. So anyway, toughness was just, but toughness was your armor, toughness was your damage resistance, toughness was trying to take into account, like, procced abilities.
Yeah, and how often you would crit, or how, like, when in terms of, like, life steal and damage dealt.
It was trying to take into account your resistances to certain elements. It was trying to combine all of the things that made it, all of your damage resistance, your HP pool, all of that into one single number.
Which I appreciate what they were trying to do. Right? It's a great idea. I think the problem with that system that I found is I almost never looked at those numbers.
Nope.
The only reason I cared about them was relatively.
Yeah, it was all arbitrary.
Like, did it go up or down?
Yeah.
That's all I really care about. If I'm equipping a weapon that's going to give me more toughness,
right,
and it gives you a sense of like how much more toughness, right. That was pretty much the most useful thing about those numbers.
Right.
I didn't actually end up caring about like the exact amount of toughness.
Correct.
Because, well, first of all, everything in Diablo is on a sliding scale. We've talked about this.
Yes. Yeah.
The Diablo's the difficulty is completely arbitrary, but also. Just once numbers get big enough where they're in like the thousands and the millions, like it just becomes really hard to wrap your head around. Like, what does 15 million toughness give you that 14 million toughness doesn't give you? You know, it's like, how much harder am I really to kill for something?
Absolutely.
And so I think for that reason, the numbers don't do a great job capturing that. So I think there may have been like some other ways that could be done in the UI, like maybe like allow the character to pick like against a specific enemy or against a specific damage type, how long would I last, or something like that. It's just hard to roll all of that information up into a few numbers. Now you brought up something with the health globes too, which I think is pretty interesting.
Right. Well, even past just staying on those three numbers, so they have the damage.
Regen.
Damage, recovery, and toughness being the three things, the three big numbers. And so similarly, you said, I think the idea behind that was in fact to simplify itemization. Right. So if you equip something that makes your toughness go up and your recovery go down and your damage stay even, then you have a very quick version of what that means, and so on and so forth. Which I think is a really good idea. The problem was that, especially even if you got past beating Diablo 3's like story mode, basically you got like to trying to optimize a class at all. You'd very quickly find that actually those numbers were basically like in high-end, not even like pushing greater rifts like the super end game, but just like optimizing a class with certain builds. The builds were it was just impossible. The system was too complex, and I forget what the term was, but there's a term for like your like on paper toughness basically.
Right.
Or your on paper damage. Sometimes you would build a class, particularly too, like there were a bunch of things that would change during, like you'd have to pull up your numbers in combat to see what they were, as opposed to at rest. Like for instance, the Barbarian had a huge thing that was, one of its huge ones was basically the longer you're in combat, the more damage you do up to a cap.
Right.
So finding what your damage was at that 20 cap.
You had to put yourself into that situation and get that buff before you could actually see what the numbers
Exactly.
were.
And there were tons of things like that. Almost all of the endgame stuff was going to be dependent on those sort of things. So your paper level... So there are a lot of times where you would have to equip... You do certain... You'd equip a certain level of gear, or you'd equip a set that would give you lower stats, actually, than seemed optimal, but would give you abilities that would then be able to boost you into, times 20 or 30 what your toughness would have been otherwise, and give you survivability. Similar with regen, all of that jazz. So your paper toughness, those paper stats actually became pretty much meaningless.
Because abilities became so much...
set bonuses became like, this ability will do 400% more damage.
Right.
And those numbers didn't they just couldn't take that into calculation.
Right.
So I think that was good for leveling in terms of, you just try to optimize. It also gets a little bit... It's a hard thing, right? Does it get a little bit too boring where you just always equip the thing that gives you better damage? I mean, I guess having those three things, being able to, hey, do you want more regen and all that jazz, versus do you want to be harder to kill, versus do you want to do more damage?
Right.
Those are easy, simple decisions, and there is so much itemization in the leveling process that I think that actually is appropriate. Now, what you were talking about was going back to another UI element of Diablo 3 is the health bar, which this was interesting. I remember thinking this watching like high level Diablo, like watching people like streamers like do greater rifts and stuff. it was impossible for me to tell. This is just a thing on streaming too that we could talk about sometime. But it was impossible for me to tell mastery from the game. It just appeared. I couldn't tell. Diablo's really, there is a level of being able to know what you're looking at and knowing that people can play certain builds better than others, or high skill builds versus lower skill builds.
Right.
But a lot of it is really just getting the build correct.
Right.
That's the big part of the game, and then getting lucky on a lot of the randomness of the dungeons. But anyway, the point is, what would happen is, I'd see what appeared to be completely identical run, and then suddenly the stream would just die. And I was like, I don't know what they did wrong. I don't know why they died. I don't know what just happened.
Yeah.
And what happens is basically the extremity of the levels of health and regen. Like, the way they tailored the game to work is damage mitigation is a big part of it, but they like tailored it to be such. If you're taking like damage at all, basically you're like in dire straits. But also the way that regen tends to work is that like your health bar if you see your health bar moving at all. Like I said, that's a really bad thing, and it tends to look like it's going down and then jumping up and then going down. Like it's always moving. It's very rare that you'll see a very gradual decline in health, and you can like adapt to whatever you're doing. It's like if you're in a danger area, hopefully you're like the second your regen gets overcome, you die. You just like it's immediate. It's instant.
Because the number of attacks coming in is just insane.
Right.
The amount of damage versus what you're recovering. Like I think. Even when you said like if you're taking any damage, what you mean is if you see a movement in your health globe, like that's a big deal.
Precisely.
And the reason that's a big deal is because like you aren't just. It's difficult because what the player is seeing is a fixed gauge, but really what you're managing is two different rates.
Yep. Precisely.
Right? Where you have a rate at which
incoming
you're healing,
damage
and you have
and
a rate of incoming damage.
Yep.
And when the incoming damage is greater than the healing damage, then that means you're going to start losing the fight. And unfortunately, your maximum health pool is small enough that you don't have very long where you can lose that fight before you're just dead.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly what it is. It's those rates are always. It would be more helpful if you actually saw those two rates as bars almost.
That would be much more helpful.
So you could begin to give it a sense of how close you were to beginning to dipping into your little tiny, relatively to the numbers that are happening, health pool.
Right.
And I think that makes a ton of sense for the design of the game, where you're murdering, dozens of enemies are on screen at a time, and so damage does always have to be incoming. The game's not about avoiding damage; it's about not standing in the fire, maybe.
Yeah.
But in large part, you can't not get hit by things.
Right.
So it's all about building and doing the right things to make sure that all of your damage mitigation stays up and popping cooldowns at the right time, all that jazz.
Right.
It's a lot less about positioning. It's not Dark Souls at all. You're always going to be taking damage.
Right.
So hence the mechanic became mitigating all of that damage, and if you begin taking damage that can hit into your health, then you're pretty much just boned. So that's a great point, that really that mechanic is happening. It's just you have to learn to intuit that as a player, actually, and that's what makes a good Diablo player, is being able to figure out how close you are to being able to take damage and all that jazz.
Right. But I would say that's a failing of the UI.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
What you described of like two different bars that were competing and growing at different rates, I think that would be way easier to read.
So compare that to, we're going to dip a little bit into the RTS here in terms of something that the really big, huge RTSs, so like Supreme Commander, Total Annihilation, Planetary Annihilation, we're talking about like the biggest, basically the largest scale true RTSs that you can find.
Yes, big does not mean popular in this case.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no. Scale-wise. And both in terms of just the maps and the units and what's happening on screen, but as well as the amount of resources that are coming in and being managed in real time.
Yeah.
The way that those did it is exactly, they only showed it as rates. Imagine like think about it, especially early in the game, like when you have like very little amount of storage, right? You can only store a small amount of your materials, both energy and mass. And imagine if you had no rates and you were building things, and just all of a sudden you just saw your entire storage just go wiped out.
Right.
And then you would like try to change your rates until like you just go back up to maximum again. Right. Because it would go so quickly. And obviously once you invest heavily in storage, you'll begin to have a little bit of buffer there. But in general, again, the rates were so gigantic in those games that if you went net zero, if you went into the red on a resource, you would have seconds at best to be able to change, turn things off or change them. Yeah. And again, it would take not too long to build those back up. Yeah. Again, unless you put huge amounts into storage, which most people didn't. I would do just because that was fun, and you'd have a little bit more. The more you did, the more buffer you got, right?
Right, and then you actually had some.
But that was also not realistic for actual competitive play, right? No one would ever put stuff into storage. It was all about the race, and that did have that bar. You just had it as a plus or minus, so you did have a sense of where it was going. Now, one problem with that UI was specifically finding out where all of that resources was going. You only had one single number, right? And so you did just have to guess in terms. It was really hard to convey, hey, what's taking up this amount of metal?
Right.
We talked about even a graph. There would be a lot of information, but the best way to do that would just be a breakdown of like, hey, here's this unit's taking up this, or even just by factory or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
This is where all of your metal's going.
Right.
You don't get any of that. You just get, this is the net amount you have, plus or minus.
And that's extremely hard to convey real time in a way that you can react to quickly.
For sure.
For people who don't know the UI we're referencing, basically at the top of your screen there will be like a number, and the number would be either green or red for how much, like say we'll do energy, right? How much energy you have.
Plus or minus too.
Yeah.
Along with it,
so you'd have like the total number of energy, which you hope is just whatever your bar can hold. Hopefully it's maxed, right?
Right.
And then you would have a number next to that was like, that would tell you the amount that you were gaining per unit of time.
Per tick.
Probably per second, but it could be arbitrary.
Yeah, I don't know what it was.
So yeah, per tick. And if that number was red, that meant that overall you had a deficit in your flow of energy, and then that the bar, that your total allotment, was going to start draining.
Right.
And if it was positive, then your storage was going to start filling, and eventually your storage would max out.
Right.
And so the numbers help you to visualize the rate, right? If you were at plus 50, then you could probably afford to start another process because you had some extra energy.
And costs were, like, unit costs were in rate, too. Like, this would cost, like, 10 energy per tick, as opposed to you seeing the total amount of energy. You could see that, too, but most of the time costs would be in rate. So if you got 50 plus energy and something's going to cost 10, you can build 4. You can build 5 of those and be at that, and nothing will happen at all to your storage, right?
Which is what you want to do, right?
Exactly.
You want
to always be
zero as you can.
Yeah, precisely.
Because that means that you're actually utilizing all the resources you have. Now you still might be not utilizing them well, but if you're not utilizing them at all, then you know they're not.
And in a game like PA, particularly, it was really just about the more stuff you had. It was outside of if this thing could attack. If you had air and you had nothing to attack air, that made a difference. But if you just utilized the resources better, you would almost always win. And that's the difference. That's an old thing in RTSs going all the way back to Command and Conquer or StarCraft. You always want to. I remember not getting this as a kid. I always wanted the most amount of resources as possible. And in competitive play, you always want you want your banks to be extreme. You basically want to be at zero. Actually, your storage, quote unquote, in those games where you just would have a bank that wouldn't show rates at all. It would just show your bank, right? Actually, later, StarCraft 2 would eventually institute UI changes that would show the rates.
Really? Yes. I didn't know that.
Yep.
I think that makes so much sense.
And particularly, like, what putting another person on minerals would do to the rate, as opposed to what it would do in terms of, like, the counter of how many you would have. Anyway, point is, all that is to say, that thing has been true forever in RTS, that you do want that net to actually be close to zero, not because you don't want a lot of resources, but it means you're utilizing getting every single ounce of.
You don't win an RTS by collecting resources.
No, not at all.
You win an RTS by producing units and using those to kill people.
And I guess the only time you would ever see a bank of stuff would be, and you can use that strategically, right? Sometimes if you're saving up for something big, which in really heavy production games usually aren't doing.
Right.
That was the problem. One major problem with PA was there wasn't a whole lot of reason to get the big, huge, expensive units or planet enders. Maybe sometimes a planet ender, but like most of the time it was just better, especially if it was one planet, to just mass produce as many of your units as possible, and you just overwhelm the other player.
Right.
As opposed to saving up for a Titan or something like that.
Yeah, I was gonna say they tried to fix that a little bit with Titans.
I don't know how that affected play at all. Did people save up?
Most of the time, you didn't get that far into the game.
Yeah, you wouldn't be able to go that long. Anyway, all this to say about UI. The level of the problem with Diablo 3 was exactly that they didn't show any of those rates whatsoever and built the game around it. Not all games are really built around that. Like I said, a lot of the other early RTSs, you had, so Command & Conquer, you have one resource, it's just money. And you can see it moving up and down, and you see your bank, you see a cost of a unit, you click on the unit. There's another conversation here to be had in terms of pay as you go, or just you click the button, the unit takes some time to build, but the second you click it, all of the money comes out, as opposed to it goes down at a rate as you're building the unit, right? Yeah. So regardless, having one resource to manage that way, it was never an issue. People were able to figure out, the way that the flow of money and the flow of things was sufficient to be able to figure out.
Well, when you have like continuous flows of things, like what you were saying, if you pay up front, it's just a discrete cost, right? Like one time you pay 500, whatever.
Right. It goes away. Yeah.
But unfortunately, or fortunately, the way RTSs are constructed, things are done continuously. Right? The mining happens continuously. and the way that you build units is done continuously.
It's all time-based.
And I think it's interesting why that eventually happened, right? Because at first they didn't do that. At first it was pay as you go. And I think why that happened was because once you get to a large enough scale, it is effectively continuous.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
because
if you've got 30 factories building units,
right,
like,
you're always creating something.
Yeah, something is always draining your money. If you've got 40 different miners, somebody's always depositing it into the bank.
Yep.
So even though it's a discrete event,
right.
if you have enough discrete events happening in a small time window, it starts to feel continuous, right?
Yeah,
this is why we can digitize music. Same reason.
Sure. And there's a lot of
Diablo ended up with the same problem, right? Like, they are discrete hits, but when you have 30 enemies on the screen hitting you, like, it's effectively a raid.
Right. Yeah, and it's completely impossible in terms of the type, again, just constrained to an ARPG. It didn't have the ability to introduce enough UI improve, like, other than just that bar we were talking about. Like, if you're trying to make that intuitive on the game and show how much damage every single hit was doing, that's just too much for you to process, right? There's no possible way to do that, to think about them in all terms of all the discrete attacks that are happening. Or the discrete attacks that you're giving out. I mean, even there, again, you have, like, numbers pop for crits, but, like, that's entirely arbitrary. Like, you can set, you know, before an encounter, decide how much damage you want to be doing, and then look for that number, but that's about it, right? So in general, yeah, you have to literally, that's a great point. If you have enough discrete examples of a thing, the only way to really condense that and give it to a person is as a raid.
Yeah.
And that was what Diablo needed to do and didn't manage to do. And obviously the game is, we've talked about this. It was plenty successful, and I've played a lot of it, and I love it. And it is eventually, like I said, like something you learn, like as you play it, is to learn how, like, get a sixth sense of how much damage, or how close you are to beginning to take damage,
right?
Or how much damage you can take, or how much type of damage you can take, and you play around that. But yeah, I think that's a great example of a UI, what seems to be a very simple UI fix that would probably be a lot. I think I would add a ton to the game.
Yeah, it would really help.
So you know exactly how safe you're at all points.
Instead of intuition having to sort of overcome a weird UI, you would actually be augmented by the UI. Right? You could use your brain to focus on other things other than, like, trying to pay attention to, like, how much is my health globe flickering up and down?
Yeah. Or even
that's
just
weird.
How much is each tick? Like I said, like in general, if you saw it moving, that was bad. But sometimes you'd see it just dip a little bit and then it'd go back immediately. And so that's like, okay, I'm like getting kind of close. But if you saw it like dip like twice and it like went down to half on 2 ticks, then you're like, okay, crap, something's really bad, right?
Yeah.
And of course, that was all in proportion to your regen. So if your regen was high enough, it doesn't matter how much damage you took. Like, you'd see those ticks and immediately go away. Like, you could get a better sense if you had lower regen, because you'd actually see the globe be down, and then that would be more responsible. If you got another semblance of hits like that, then you died because your regen wasn't fast enough.
Right.
You know, so it was a weird. It is a weird system. I think that was in large part due to the that particularly like the red globe of like liquid was a super iconic part of the Diablo UI that they just couldn't do away with. But I think that would, and I don't know, like how, like Path of Exile was the other kind of, people usually talked about that as the superior version of Diablo 3 even.
Yeah.
And I don't know how they handled. I think it was similar in terms of even UI, where they had a globe of a different color of liquid.
That's right.
And I don't know how that. I don't know how like the speed or the combat worked in terms of maintaining health. If it was more. Because, like, the other answer, right, is to just kind of tone everything down a little bit and make it more gradual, so it doesn't have to be this, like, you know, utilizing numbers in the millions, or increasing the health pool, right? Wouldn't that be another piece of it?
Yeah.
If you increase your storage so much, then you have more margin for things to be able to move up and down and get a sense of where the rate's going, as opposed to needing to see the rates at all times.
Yeah, if you have a bigger gauge. I think one of the problems with Diablo is that the gauges relative to the rates is so small.
Yeah.
And so
maybe Path of Exile just had a better balance there.
Yeah, it could have had a better balance. I would say, like, if you just have a gauge, then you can get a pretty good sense of like the changing of the rates.
It
just has to be big enough.
Yeah,
right?
it comes directly in, because we were just talking about how great health bars were.
Right.
In terms of giving you so much information intuitively, but they have to be tuned correctly.
Yeah. And I think, basically the rates, if the fluctuations in the rates can overcome the entire health bar
immediately, then that
potentially, then like you got to have some other way to communicate to the player that that's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Right? They can't just come out of the blue and then you're dead and you're like, why the heck did that happen?
Yeah, exactly.
I was doing fine. I was at full health.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And then the full health bar, it becomes meaningless.
Yeah, exactly, because it doesn't actually tell you how close you are to dying, which is one of the things you use health bars for.
Yeah, that's really interesting. like, so thinking back to kind of my idea, so one thing I was thinking about too, I don't know how much time we have left, or how much you want to get covered, but one thing that I was thinking about in terms of tuning.
Start wrapping up.
Yeah. So this is a decent little just segue into. I was DMing for the first time in D&D. I've run two scenarios so far, and one of the interesting things, just in terms of we're talking about like health or UI. This was something that was not adequately conveyed and very nearly killed one of my player characters off the bat, and I actually had to fudge the rules a bit to keep one of them alive, and which was my fault. I didn't punish it because it felt like it was my doing. But basically, what happens is I normally in D&D you'll have a kind of ideal is probably like 3 to 5 player characters. That's what most of the literature is written around. So when they talk about like how difficult things are, it's in that regard. And I had like 7. Which is a lot. On top of I was playing an NPC along with them, so they basically had 8 player characters in a fight. And this didn't come up too much in terms of like balance until the boss fight at the end of the introductory dungeon, whereas 8 on 1. And the way that I decided to make up for this was obviously just putting a more powerful creature in than would normally be able to be fought by first level parties. The problem with that was that it had the correct amount of health. In terms of the amount of damage that could be dealt to it, where you had 8 characters dealing damage in 1 round. So it was appropriately difficult to take down. It was unfortunately unappropriately lethal, where it got onto one of my player characters and did 4 times enough damage to kill her in 1 hit. And that's an insta-kill too, not just like knock unconscious, which is basically she was brought to negative 4 times her maximum health in 1 hit, and she was at max health. So that was and like I said, I fudged the rules, and she got knocked unconscious and got saved because she didn't want to re-roll, and that made sense. But that was an interesting thing in that the level, like, health is only talked about just discretely as a number in D&D. You just have HP, right? And in fact, nothing even changes the way the game's built, is that the difference between 1 HP and max HP is actually nothing. You're still just as powerful at 1 HP as you are at the top. And that's just a quality of life thing. So when you take just completely 100% discrete numbers, I mean, this, again, just goes back to when the attack rates are too high, right? When you can deal 25 damage in 1 hit and you have 6 HP, and your storage, which is your HP, was a 6. Yeah. She went from 0 to, there's no chance she was on and then dead immediately. Right. And there's no time to react, there's no time to do anything.
It's like, why even have 6 HP? Like, the health is meaningless at that
Exactly.
point.
So
it's like basically hit or not hit.
Ways around that would be, either conveying the depth of power, which is not something that D&D does, right? Like, when you encounter a monster, you don't know anything about it. You don't know its attacks, you don't know how fast it does damage, you don't know how much health it has. In fact, that's up to the DM. You don't have a health bar. I usually will, you describe as the creature takes damage
what's happening
what it looks like, and that hopefully is kind of enough for the player to be able to begin doing things. Similarly too with like the resistance or vulnerability mechanic in D&D, which is just resistance takes half damage from these sources if you're resistant to them, and then vulnerability takes double. It's also up to the DM to say, I never say like it takes. I usually don't say how many points of damage it got dealt, based on the attack. I say, you get the sense that it should have done more than. You'd think it would have done more than what it did, would appear to affect the character. So those are all that's less UI. That's just like direct description, I suppose. That's an instance of a game that is text based, right? It's all speech.
I would say that is it is a form of a UI, right? Like,
but it works.
Yeah,
it's intuitive without just
when the player learns that, like, when you say that, it means that I'm not doing as much damage as I should be.
And they can translate into mind to resistant.
Right, exactly. So this player is resistant to piercing damage or something like that. Right. And so, like, it does become a form of UI now. It's weird because it's all tabletop, so it's like your words sort of become a UI as the DM when,
so
saying things like it's looking kind of rough is like, oh, that's like the health bar being low, right? Like that's as close as you might get in D&D.
In fact, one of my players was trying to figure out exactly what certain words meant. Like when I'd say looking rough to looking pretty rough to looking really rough, he thought that was like 3/4, half, 1/4. Okay. Which it wasn't. That's like under 10% is when I start saying rough. Right. Mitch, if you're listening, which you're not, don't read into much of that. But anyway, I think that just goes to show, like, to kind of wrap things back up, I guess. Sure. we're talking about a game, D&D, that is entirely text-based, quote unquote, right? It's all just words, right? Almost entirely, minus maybe combat where you have like a battle map and miniatures. But almost literally, it's all just words. And so in that way, the UI that I get to utilize as the DM being shorthand or in-world kind of intuitive, hey, this is the way it's working to cloud a mechanic, instead of saying this is resistance and it took half damage.
Right.
In this case, words work just fine. We were talking about how words tended to be something you want to avoid in the visual mediums.
Right, in real-time mediums specifically.
Yeah, exactly. And D&D combat is turn-based.
Exactly.
So in this case, it all all of this adds up and works pretty darn well in a kind of quote-unquote text-based, turn-based, and non-visual medium.
Right.
So again, it's not really just like I just always want to stray away from making really huge absolute like text is always a bad thing. Like that's not the point.
Right.
It's context dependent on what you're trying to accomplish for the type of game that you're doing.
Yeah.
Video games are entirely visual, so that's why we're talking about these sort of things. Also, I mean, you can talk to anyone that's played D&D with or without battle maps for large combat encounters, and that is a huge difference.
Oh yes.
You can talk to my players. I didn't have a battle map prepared for the boss fight, and it worked out because there was only one character. But I had to draw. I have this hilarious. I should show you this sketch that I drew, like in my DM notebook, that just looks like the ravings of a madman. I mean, it's like a circle with arrows and symbols and junk. That worked for me, but obviously wouldn't work for other people.
Right.
So anyway, all that is to say, UI is dependent on the thing that you are working inside of. There's no excellent or horrible. It seems to be the thing that best communicates and hopefully gives some level of kind of immersion as opposed to taking you out of the game that you're playing.
Right. In D&D, you're having a lot of conversations already, so having somebody tell you something that you might need to know makes a lot of sense. You're already having conversations. You're not having conversations with a video game that has like an audio clip.
Right.
And then tells you what to do.
Yeah.
So I think it's a good place for us to leave it. If you guys have thoughts on UI, you can email Muxl at gergandmuxl.com. You can email Gerg at gergandmuxl.com.
Yeah.
That'll get to each one of us. Let us know what you're thinking, and we will see you next time. We'll be doing a stream next week on a game. Stay tuned.
As of yet undecided.
Yes.
And we might give a little bit more room for... I feel like there's been other things we could talk about in terms of the UI. Specifically, I'm just an RTS
Oh, yes.
fanatic, and I was thinking specifically about all the different RTSs and the way that those UIs get utilized. Because I think more than any other genre, you have different UIs for different... Like, you can very much easily tell... there's just different strategies. I think in large part, a lot of action games have figured out UIs pretty well. In terms of they're all going to be pretty similar, and this is where stuff goes, or JRPGs, normal RPGs, Western RPGs, excuse me. But RTSs, man, they have a whole UI is like half of the game itself. So we might do another episode on that. Maybe we'll stream in RTS next week.
Yeah. Maybe.
All right, guys. Well, you have a good week and a good holiday season, and we will talk to you later.